On today's World Insight, the huge cost of conflict would spook global markets and biting sanctions, the impact of the world economy, and who's bearing the brunt.
So I would say that as time goes by, Russia will find it more and more difficult to cope with the resource consumption by the war.
And the Ukraine refugee crisis takes a turn for the worse as thousands more flee their homes. How the UN Refugee Agency is doing its part to provide help.
Hello, I'm Tian Wei, and welcome to World Insight. We continue our coverage on the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Today, its impact on the Russian economy. Russian President Vladimir Putin on Tuesday signed a decree that prohibits the capital flight of 10,000 words or more out of Russia. The move comes in response to Western sanctions imposed on Russia, including kicking Russia out of the SWIFT system. According to media reports, the French finance minister even declared a, quote, all-out economic and financial war against Russia to bring down its economy. Elsewhere, the highly anticipated Nord Stream 2 pipeline that was intended to deliver Russian natural gas to Germany had its certification revoked by Germany in response to Russia's forces entering Ukraine. The operator of the pipeline has now filed for bankruptcy. So how are all these economic moves impacting Russia and the global market? How costly is the military operation? Here's the panel we invited. In Washington, D.C., William Li, chief economist of the Milken Institute. In Hong Kong, Hong Hao, managing director and head of research at Decoupling International. In Beijing, Professor Michael Powers from the Department of Finance at the School of Economics and Management in Tsinghua University. And also in Beijing, Liu Baocheng, Dean of the Center for International Business and Ethics from the University of International Business and Economics. I'm glad to be joined by William Li, Hong Hao, Michael Powers, and Liu Baocheng. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Let me start by asking, how much do you think there would be the possibility of the collapse of the Russian economy as a result of latest sanctions and the SWIFT actions? Mr. Li.
I think the impact on Russia is going to be really significant. Russia has been treated to sanctions in the past. And I think over time, the last several years, it's learned to adapt its economy to live more autonomously. But nevertheless, Russia still depends a lot on Western trade, and certainly the oligarchs who control Russia enjoy their luxury goods from the West. So cutting them off will also have an effect.
Mr. Hong.
After all, it's an economy that's relying on heavily on oil export, and now that oil is being sanctioned, oil trade is being sanctioned, and also many of the international major oil companies is actually backing out of the trade voluntarily. So I would say that as time goes by, Russia will find it more and more difficult to cope with the resource consumption by the war.
Mr. Powers, we understand the $630 billion in reserves of foreign currency and gold earlier by the Russian side. Do you see that could help Russia overcome the current difficulty?
In theory, of course, yes, it could. And my understanding is Russia has been stockpiling assets, foreign reserve assets, for a number of years, moving them to source or to countries where they would have greater access in the case of sanctions. I think about 50% of it, that $630 billion that you mentioned, will still be available to the Russians. But the absence of the other 50% is certainly going to hurt their economy. And really, my feeling about the long-term impact is that the issue is one of morale. How are the ordinary people in Russia going to tolerate this? How are Vladimir Putin's very wealthy friends going to tolerate it?
Professor Liu, the Russian side has been talking about the propaganda war in the West against Russia. Now, how much do you think the sanctions and the impacts of sanctions, the swift actions and advocates of further actions against the Russian economy is part of what Russia considers as the so-called propaganda war from the West against Russia, or really the real impact is happening right now?
Russia has been playing more resilience into this one, but I think they are also moving into a dangerous zone by threatening to confiscate the individuals and corporate assets of foreign companies or foreign entities. So that's going to spook a lot of assets flight. And plus that even though they have enough gold to cushion such sort of crisis, but liquidity is still a big problem because right now they are being already cut off, from the rest of the world financially, logistically, and also politically.
Mr. Powers, we see reports suggesting in the media about the two largest banks in Russia, Sberbank and VTB, have been suffering tremendously, particularly their overseas branch, for example, those branches in Eastern Europe countries. Now, how much do you see these largest banks are reacting? How do you see the interest rates rise to 20% and more selling of foreign currency by the Russian side going to help them to overcome the temporary difficulties, or at least in the very short term?
With regard to the large banks that have been precluded from using the SWIFT system, at least for non-energy related transactions, they are going to have to scramble to find alternative means to survive. They're supported by the Russian government, so they probably will not fail, at least in the short term. But they will have to find alternative ways to move their money around. With regard to the increase in the interest rates, I think that that's designed primarily to support the ruble, to keep Russian people from going to the bank and withdrawing their money and buying whatever they can with it before it goes to zero in value. So I think that there are difficulties. There are ways they can work around some of them. Ultimately, it's going to be a question of what the people can tolerate.
Mr. Hong, we have seen the Russian side since 2014 on the Crimea crisis suffered from the Western sanctions, and this time, of course, new rounds of heavy sanctions by many Western economies, even including neutral states like Switzerland. Meanwhile, there's been a lot of talk about kicking Russia out of the SWIFT system. But how do you see the Russians' preparations earlier over the years would help them to overcome, to a certain extent, what they are experiencing now?
Before they instigated the war, they must have, some strategic planning. It's hard for me to think that, they haven't prepared for this. And I think right now the SWIFT sanction seems to be excluding the oil trade, and the oil trade and the exports of natural gas and oil to many of the European countries remain uninterrupted, according to reports. So I think it really takes a lot of determination, to exclude the oil trade, which is almost half of European energy supply. Even though over time, I think after this crisis, the European countries may, plan to move away from Russian oil, because the U.S. now is one of the biggest oil and gas exporters. But it will take years for that to happen. So I think for now, the Russians' means to finance its war by selling oils remain largely intact. So as a result, even though there are many different reports reporting on both sides' victories and losses, it is very hard for us, sitting from a very far distance, to have a real assessment of what is really going on in the ground in Ukraine. And I think now the war is moving to different places. Many of the great Ukraine cities are being surrounded. And, this morning there are reports saying that on the ground battle has started to be fought in the cities. So it's a different phase, a different type of resource commitment. At this phase of the war, it will require substantially more resource commitment. So it remains to be seen in the near term, whether Russia can go on such as this.
About the oil and gas, many of our earlier panelists talked about that. Russia is still one of the key providers, even to the European countries. Things are likely to change as a result of the latest development on military conflicts. So how do you see, on the bigger picture, oil and gas, Russia's role and the rest of the world, particularly the United States?
Well, in connection to your previous questions to Mr. Hong, is that when Russia was prepared since 2014 to reduce their dependence on the world, and the world has also been preparing to reduce dependence on Russia as well, because this is really a reciprocal process. And now the world is trying to have more determination to diversify the resource supply from the rest of the world, and reducing the dependence on Russia's gas and oil supply is definitely a question, even if the war is really putting into an end, because they proved again to be unpredictable. And of course, when Europe with more than 40% reliance on the supply of oil and gas from Russia. So that's going to reverberate over the entire supply chain. And more profoundly, I think it's going to impact the structural portfolio of the whole world. When the oil and gas prices are raising on a high bar, the rich countries can have better access, but poor countries are left even more in desperation to the excess of oil and gas in terms of supporting their industrialization process.
I think that ultimately it's a question of what Russia can do to insulate its economy in the short run from the Russian side, and then from the West, what's the degree to which they can free themselves of dependence on Russian fossil fuels. My thinking is that although there's just disruption and there will be chaos in the Russian economy as a result of the various sanctions, there are certain things that won't happen. For example, the Russians will not run out of fuel in their campaign against Ukraine. The Russians will not run out of food in their campaign, or at least it's not likely unless they have severe disturbances in production at home. So I think that what we may be seeing is what already was somewhat telegraphed through Russian actions in the years coming up, that they were drawing back their assets from a number of Western countries. They were trying to become more self-sufficient in terms of financial transactions and so forth. They're going to move more in that direction. The West is also going to move more in that direction. But the problem is that as there's more of a split, there's also less leverage, less ability for the West to use its diplomatic, its economic leverage over Russia to achieve the ends that it wants. So in a sense, that may force the West into a stronger military posture.
Mr. Li, there has been a lot of talk in the West about so-called decoupling from Russia. And do you see now that is what is going on right now? Do you see this as a hiccup in the interaction between Russia and the West, or this is very much likely to be a very critical stage for the West and for Russia to make their decisions?
Well, this is a very good opportunity for the West to really take stock of where Russia stands in the international order. One characterization, even though you mentioned earlier that the world order and the changing world order is very complex, the nuclear capability is the biggest leverage it's got militarily, and economically, its critical supplier of gas and fuels to Europe is the other lever. One easiest way to deal with that is to allow other suppliers to come back online. The biggest supplier of energy in the world was the United States for 3 years ago, until the current administration cut off the capability of the United States to produce a lot more energy. So in some ways, we in the United States allowed the Russians to gather more leverage and to stop the Russians from exerting this kind of power.
Russia's energy supply, not only to Europe, but also to many emerging and developing economies. You also see very clearly the signals coming from different countries about how they interpret the impacts of what's going on between Russia and Ukraine on their own. Mainly, many developing countries are still looking at the situation. So how do you see Russia being the 11th largest economy in the world and a main oil and gas provider for many economies, likely to have the impact on the rest of the world, both their economies and also their energy supplies?
Yeah, well, already the carbon price in Europe dropped more than 30%. So I think the world, even after this conflict, is probably the goal moving towards green energy is going to be postponed. Now people realize that energy can be quite important, quite expensive at times like this, and it pays to have backup. I think for emerging markets, countries, they are because the access to energy is one of the conditions for economic growth. Right, so I think up to 18% of Russian exports before this conflict actually goes to China. So I wouldn't be surprised that that export portion would increase in importance. I think other emerging markets may see the same picture as well, in the sense that they may now be able to get their hands on a cheaper Russian oil. It remains to be seen, because now oil trade is whether the oil trade is within the scope of sanction. It is still unclear to many. So I think many, for example, many of the oil traders and oil importing companies are actually calling up their lawyers to ask, whether dealing with some of the Russian oil companies would have a reverberance effect in later days by U.S. So it remains to be seen. Once again, there's just so much uncertainty. But I think oil, after this conflict, has proven to be even more important than before, and that is why I think oil price in the international market has been surging relentlessly.
There are a lot to come, certainly, and a lot to be analyzed. I hope I will be joined by all of you later, in the later days, as things evolve. Thank you so much for all of you. Hong Hao, William Li, Michael Powers, Liu Baocheng. Thank you, gentlemen.